Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. It's actually really hot out today, so I had to crack the window next to me, so I apologize if the audio is a little noisier than usual, but nothing you could do when you live in a big city, I guess. Anyway, let's jump right in and get into the questions. First up are a few questions from TJ, and the number one is they're looking for a better auto HDMI switch. I really am not going to be much help other than to point you in the direction of the thread that Dave, aka Dirk Swizzler, made up on Shmups, where they talk about good HDMI switching and different kind of equipment that they've tested. I myself have had very bad luck with a lot of this equipment, mostly audio and auto switching, and I really wish to have the opposite of what you were asking for. I really would love just a mechanical push-button switch, like the Otaku switch, but for HDMI, so I don't have to worry about anything anymore. You just press a mechanical switch, and it's the mechanical equivalent of unplugging an HDMI cable and plugging another into each other, and I don't want any automated options. And having something mechanical like that might even be able to pass through all signals as well. It's as long as it's routed well. I don't know. It's wishful thinking because I don't think one like that exists, or at least one that has a lot of inputs. As far as an automatic solution, the only things I've seen that I would feel confident saying would work are pro-level stuff that's just not worth the price, unless you're mega rich, and then by all means, go dump $4,000 on an HDMI switch. But if not, then yeah, it's probably just too much. So if you have a solution that works, you say you use two 5x1 switches, maybe that's going to be good enough for you. Look into other stuff, but definitely check out that thread that Dave put up on Shmups, because they're constantly testing new equipment when they get a chance to. And the second question is on surge protecting. You use two Belkin surge protectors with high joule ratings, but your setup makes them hard to manage. So I guess you were looking at different power strip options. For me personally, I don't trust any of the surge protection, if you will, in any of these things. So what I've done, based on recommendations from Renee from DB Electronics as well as others, is there's an APC box that's linked to right in the Amazon store that I have linked in the description. There's an APC box that's, I don't want to call it a power conditioner, but it keeps things more even. And it's cheap. It's $50. I mean, cheap compared to what some of these power conditioners cost. Some of the higher end ones are over $1,000. And I have, and there is a max rating for that, but since I don't have all of my equipment on at the same time, on one setup I have just my D32 monitor and whatever console's plugged into that hooked up on one cart. I have another one hooked up to my main TV setup with my OLED TV and any HDMI equipment. Once again, even though there's a bunch of stuff plugged into that, it's only a few combination of things plugged on at the same time, turned on and plugged in at the same time. So it should be fine for that. So for me personally, I just make sure that whatever surge protector, if you want to call it that, but really just a multi input powers thing. I just don't buy crappy ones. I try to buy the Belkin ones that have 12 inputs, just because it kind of fits the you could use the wall warts on the outside and the thin ones, thin power connectors on the middle, and I have those going into the APCs. And the last time we really got into that was years ago, but we kind of determined that that's okay for most people's setups. And the only exception would be if you have things like a router and a wireless modem, and maybe even a PC and a monitor, depending, that you need to stay on if the power goes out, even for just a few seconds. And that's when you would introduce a UPS, and you would want one that's sine wave. So maybe go back and check out that other retro roundtable from a couple years ago. Nick was usually pretty good at putting in the descriptions what we talked about. So from just my personal choice, I would go. I wouldn't go farther than this for my setup, because then you could just start dumping a ton of money into things that may or may not matter at all for equipment like this. Adam Wells is trying to capture footage from a Sega Saturn using HD Retrovision component video cables and a Hauppauge capture card. And most games don't show up at all except for AM2 games. So while I haven't specifically tested AM2 games, and while I haven't put any of this on a scope, I know exactly what the issue is, and that's resolution. Most capture cards don't really understand what video game signals are, at least direct RGB signals from it, or component, or even composite in this video, I guess. So in many cases, they treat that 240p signal as 480i, so it kind of looks interlaced and weird and flickery. or it just doesn't work at all. So it's my guess that whatever game you're loading is probably booting in 480i, which is a TV signal that almost all analog capture cards should be able to read. So if your goal is to capture with that exact setup, I would just pick up any RetroTink 2X, either the original or the Pro, and that should completely solve your issue because it would line double it to 480p regardless of if it's an interlaced or a progressive source. It could be that one of the games for Saturn that's not that's a slightly different resolution. I think I have it up here. So it's most Saturn games that I know of are 320 by 224, so typical 240p essentially. Some are like the Capcom fighting games are 352 by 224, and then some are 704 by 480i. So you said AM2 and not Capcom, so I'm just going to assume that the games you're talking about are 480i, and that's why it's working. So it is a pain. It's one of the many reasons why I dug so deep into capture cards, and why I recommend so few, actually. Dr. Negative had a question about C-Sync versus composite video sync, and these things can get really confusing, and I do want to do a complete dedicated video just on this, walking through the very, very basics all the way up to pretty much right where Displaced Gamers did their video on it, and I'll hand the baton over to them to continue. So it's a confusing subject, and the fact that you asked the question means that I didn't do as good of a job as I should have on the site and in other videos and stuff. So my apologies. I talked about this before. But to get into the actual question, Dr. Negative was looking into purchasing the HD Retrovision cables for SNES, but noticed they were using sync over composite video, and saw my page saying that that was actually inferior due to line noise. Will there be a perceivable loss in quality over actual C-Sync, or are they using some sort of black magic? So there's a few factors involved. First and foremost, with fully shielded cables, there is no issue. I did a short video, just a quick overview, as well as an in-depth video that explains all about this, and basically just go to YouTube and search for retro RGB shielded cables, and you should see it. It's a picture of me making a stupid face holding cables up. I don't know why. I was trying to make myself laugh that day or something, I guess. But that video, it describes in detail what I'm about to briefly go over, and that the reason composite video over direct C-Sync would be called inferior is because you have the color information going down the sync line in a cable that's run along the other RGB lines, so that information can bleed over and cause interference. Now, if you have fully shielded cables, that's not an issue at all. So right off the bat, the HD Retrovisions are shielded, so you don't have to worry. And also the length is a big deal as well. And that's why for specific situations, if you use sync strippers inside consoles that don't output pure C-Sync, and you want to use unshielded or mildly shielded cables, if you put that sync stripper in the console side of things, or at least on the console part of the cable, you won't really notice any interference. Whereas if you put that sync stripper in the SCART head, let's say, it'll fix compatibility but not interference. And that's the only other thing that using anything other than C-Sync could cause an issue with, is compatibility with things like Extron Crosspoint switches, a couple other brands of switches. Certain monitors won't accept anything other than C-Sync. They don't understand what composite video is. They can't separate it themselves. There's no logic inside. So when you go down to the HD Retrovision cables, and actually this is one of the reasons why Steve hates SCART, is because with component video there's no issues. It's either compatible with 240p or it isn't, and you're done. You don't have to worry about different kinds of voltages. You don't have to worry about compatibility. It's just component video signal. So in that, there's shielded cables. It's a very short length anyway that goes from console to the little circuit board they have in it. So in all of the testing I've done over the years with HD Retrovision cables, the only difference I have ever noticed is in RGB monitors that were calibrated to RGB signals and not component video. So, taking 5 minutes to just do basic basic on-screen display settings, not even service menu. I was able to get them to look perfect. But the very first tests I did on the HD Retrovisions, whenever they were first released, those were the tests where I said, I think there might be a difference. I'm not really sure. I didn't have good capture equipment. I didn't have a scope. I only had an RGB monitor. And that was really when I realized that the difference is almost always settings, never quality. And then since then, over the years, I've done so many tests where I zoom in 1,000%. I put it on a scope. I look at all these things, and it proved out that the HD Retrovisions are great. So it was a good question. I certainly wasn't knocking your question. I was just knocking my own website, because I should have made that more clear. But hopefully I'll have a video coming up before the end of the year that would walk through all of this stuff. So once again, the HD Retrovisions are awesome. The only reason I would recommend them over SCART or SCART over HD Retrovision is connectivity. It's nothing to do with the signal. It's just if you're somebody that has all component video consoles and wants to add a Super Nintendo, grab the HD Retrovisions. Whereas if you have, a G-SCART switch and 7 SCART consoles plugged in, you might as well just get another SCART cable for the Super Nintendo. So hopefully I put that into perspective and explained it good enough. And there'll be a more detailed video on this soon. Joaquin Coelho said they were playing Yoshi's Island on original Super Nintendo hardware, and towards the last levels, all of a sudden the screen went blank. They had to reset the console, and after power cycling, the save game was gone. They're positive it's not the battery because they installed a battery socket a few months ago, and there's a brand new battery in there. So I have no idea what happened, but I have seen this before. Cousin Scott had a Yoshi's Island cart that just started acting up for no reason. And I think he ended up buying another one, and I took his broken one and tried different things to fix it. I think I reflowed all the chips on it. I think I double checked, so I think I swapped the battery. And it never did it again, but I also didn't spend as much time with it as he did. I kind of just played the first 2 levels to see, whereas Scott really likes that game, and he probably played all the way through it. And I believe I sent the cart to a friend of mine to test, who could do, more in-depth testing than me. And that was years ago, and I don't think we ever followed up on it. In fact, this is right now, as I'm reading your question, is the first time I'm actually remembering that I even had this issue. So I think there could be something up with, maybe the FX chip used in Yoshi's Island. Maybe it was something like they didn't have enough solder, or there was an issue where you need to reflow it, or I'm not really sure, but this has happened to more than just that one incident with Yoshi's Island before. And you said you found a few posts on GameFAQs and Reddit with people with the same issue. And somebody else said it was when they were approaching the last levels of the game. So maybe it's heat. Then it could be voltage from a bad power supply. I'm pretty sure Scott and I have always only used either the OEM power supply or like one of the triads with an adapter. But, OEM power supplies have capacitors that go bad, but I think Scott's still using the same one, and it's been years. So, there's so many things that could go wrong with this, but my gut's telling me it's probably something on the board. And if you're good at soldering, maybe try. If you said you already replaced the battery, maybe try reflowing the chips on there and see if that helps. And if you're not comfortable with that, don't worry about it. But it's, I would love to know the answer to this as well. And just once again, everything I'm saying is speculation. It is based on actual things that I've worked with, but, I don't have any solid facts on this. So maybe if you have the ability to try reflowing all the chips and go from there. I seriously doubt it could ever be an issue with the modded console that you're using, especially because you said you had it modded from Mobius, who does great work. So I'm pretty sure that's not the issue. And in fact, I can't remember. I think Scott and I both tried non-modded and modded consoles just to make sure it was nothing I did, because this was way back when I first started the site, and maybe my amp's bad or something like that. But no, I think we tried all of that. So try reflowing and see what happens. But I'm sorry I have no more data on this, and I wish we did. I wish we figured out why a few. And maybe it's not just Yoshi's Island. Maybe there's other carts doing it, but maybe they're just cheaper games that people care less about or something. But I would like to know the answer to this. Diego had a few questions. First, they wanted to know about modless optical drive emulators for the Dreamcast. I don't think that's ever going to be possible. It's not like the Saturn where you could just put the, use the other card slot and back. However, adding an optical drive emulator to the Dreamcast is very easy, and it's something that I would recommend that even if you've never modded anything before in your life, I still think I would be comfortable recommending this, because there's no soldering at all. All you have to do is make sure it's unplugged from the wall, and then unbolt it, take the top off very carefully so you don't pull on anything, and then just unbolt the CD-ROM drive, bolt in the optical drive emulator, and you're done. The only thing to add to that is I really like Greg from Laser Bear's 3D printed shells that go inside, but that's not necessary. That's just to make things easier. So if you take out your SD card to add some more games to it, put it back in and drop it in the inside the console, it's not going to short anything out. You're probably not going to hurt anything. However, now you're going to have to unbolt the console to go find the SD card. Whereas if you use the nice 3D printed shells, it seals it up so you can't accidentally drop anything in the console. So other than that, I mean, I think it's pretty straightforward, and I think you'd have no problem doing that if you wanted to. Of course, that means you have to remove the CD-ROM drive, which annoys some people, but, it's kind of nothing wrong with saving the original if you ever want to go back to games. Also, do I know of any wireless, lagless controller for the Super Nintendo? No, but there is I think it's the 8BitDo or the RetroBit. I can't remember. I pre-ordered it. I think it's the 8BitDo controller for the Super Nintendo. Just search RetroRGB. I did a whole thing on it. It's coming out next month, and it's 2.4 gigahertz wireless, not Bluetooth. So what that means is Bluetooth will always have more latency, potentially more latency than RF. And it's just the way the protocol works, and that's fine for modern games where that stuff is taken into account while the game is being made. But if you're playing a game that was made on a platform that never has more than a millisecond of input latency, and it's not even latency at that point, it's just the way the game works because it pulls the screen once every frame, then you're going to notice some lag with the Bluetooth controller. Maybe not all the time, but you will. Whereas with just a direct RF, you have potential to have incredibly low latency to the point where it's imperceptible even by the best game players on the planet, to the point where you would really need an oscilloscope to even tell the difference, not even a high-speed camera. Krix's Joy's controller performs that fast. The other 8BitDo controllers, I believe, have the potential to. They're more variable, but it varies within that one frame. So, I always talk about variable input latency to sort of put things into perspective. If you have a scaler that, or like a classic console, like the little minis that go between 3 and 7 frames of lag, that's a massive swing. You're going to notice that latency. It's going to drive you crazy at some point in the game. If you're a hardcore gamer, if you're not just kind of going on a quick nostalgia trip, like if you're really digging in. But when you're talking about milliseconds, if you have a 1 to 7 millisecond swing, I don't know if any human could perceive that at all. I believe it's half a frame, about 8 milliseconds, where people were only the most hardcore players, but people do start to detect a difference. But I think once you start getting lower than that, you're totally fine. So, I did order one. I'm going to test it, but not right away. 8BitDo has a history of making products that I like very much, that require a few firmware updates until they're kind of settled in. So I'm not throwing shade. I'm not trying to insult them. It's just unfortunately the way it is. We are everybody's beta testers now. So they get mostly done hardware, mostly done firmware, ship it out, and then our feedback determines. When I say I mean a lot of companies. That's kind of how it goes. So I'll probably test it by the end of the summer if I get it next month and see. And for myself personally, as long as it's a controller that's tested, I like wireless. I think it's easier. I use the Joy's controller all the time. In fact, I use it anytime I need a 6-button controller, and I'm really looking forward to see how the RF one for the SNES works. So the only other thing too is interference. Now, I live in an apartment building in Manhattan, surrounded by other apartment buildings. I have literally thousands and thousands of wireless interference networks around me, from everybody's cell phone and wireless network to anytime somebody turns on a microwave. So I think in scenarios like this, I would get a lot more interference than somebody who has, just a normal house in the suburbs. And I still find it good enough, at least with the Joy's controller. So while I don't know if I would ever call it lagless. I think it's, the 8BitDo stuff has the potential to be very low latency to the point where you can't even detect it. And also, thanks for the kind words. You said, hope you're doing all right during the confinement. It's funny. My life has not changed in the past 2 years. I work every day, roll out of bed, start working, work till I kind of burn out, crack open a beer, watch some TV, wake up, do it all over. So the unfortunate part is I do miss seeing my friends a lot. The very few times I've seen them, 6 feet apart with a mask on, that is kind of my reset button, because I guess I'm a bit of an extrovert and I really like being around other people. So even those days those weeks where I would, be working on 10 different projects and barely see the light of day, I'd be able to get out and have a couple, go down to Brooklyn Video Games, watch a tournament, a King of Fighters tournament happen, have a couple beers, go home. Like, even just that, I'd feel refreshed when I woke up. So it does suck not having that. But luckily it was not the best weather, so it's not like I could have been walking around in a beautiful day instead. So I just kind of took advantage and caught up on TV shows. So thanks for the kind words. Hopefully I answered your questions properly. Kelv SYC had a few questions about light guns, and the first is, can you take original consoles through a zero lag line doubler and play them on VGA CRT monitors? And I'm pretty sure the answer is no. There's a few things I'd like to test, and there's a few people I would like to talk to see if there's ways we could force this to happen, patched ROMs or something like that. But overall, I don't think you should expect that to work. If you have exactly that, if you have like an original NES, an OSSC, and one of those zero lag HDMI to VGA converters, give it a try and see what happens. But I wouldn't count on it, and I'd really like to do a video digging in deep to explain why. So I'm kind of going to give you a cop-out answer here, so I don't try to half-ass it. I want to get the proper and the good described answer out of this. Also, how do region differences play into this? So that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, because the only time I've ever used other region consoles and games is on RGB monitors that support both. So using like a PAL NES with Duck Hunt on an RGB monitor, it's going to run in a PAL mode, so there would not be any compatibility issues. And I just don't know how that would work on other CRTs, if it would work at all. Maybe consumer grade CRTs just wouldn't even see the PAL signal. So that's a good question. Both are good questions that I don't have solid answers for. But the first one, is definitely something I want to dig into, because it's a valid question. And especially now when things like VGA monitors are easier to find than RGB monitors and infinitely cheaper. So it would be kind of cool for people who have a full setup that just want to grab a VGA monitor. But that's also the other reason I suggest people always keep their eyes open for consumer grade TVs, because even if you have a full RGB setup that's, the crystal clear and works perfect, maybe you just want a giant consumer CRT, even plugged into RF only, just to play some light gun games and have some silly fun. So good questions. I'll get better answers soon. Elmer M is trying to stream using a PlayStation 3 and is having HDCP issues. And unfortunately, this is something that everybody runs into. So if you're looking to stream, the two best choices are to pick up a set of HD Retrovision component cables. They're available right on Amazon still, I believe, as well as Castlemania Games, and just use a component video capture card in order to do it that way. That's a good solution if you also have a CRT that you want to use. The other solution is to look for one of those HDMI splitters that strips HDCP, and that will absolutely work as well. I don't know the legality for talking about that, so I'm sure if you Google it, the answers will come up right away. But I have a few of them that seem to work fine. So it's a giant pain. I have a passionate hatred for HDCP, because at the time that was released, and I'm getting a little off topic here, but at the time HDCP was released, I was working for a company that designed touchscreen sealed computers for medical that also were used for installations in some very high-end home automation setups. So I got to know some people and some companies that had built projector setups with very expensive CRT projectors with component video inputs. And next thing you know, HDCP comes out and it makes them incompatible with anything that came out after it. And they basically were like, who cares, whatever. So that pissed me off from the beginning. And then HDCP has been nothing but a nuisance ever since. It's been defeated every time a new version comes out. People defeat it immediately. So all it ends up doing is not stopping piracy, but stopping people from using their consoles the way that they really want to, or watching movies or anything like that. So I think it's a giant scam. I can't stand it. I don't think it works right, but there's nothing you could do. It'd be impossible to go up against the big companies that implement that stuff. So let's just, keep an eye out for other nerds that are running into these issues and looking for reasons to strip, or looking for ways and devices that strip HDCP that allow us to keep using these things the way that we should be allowed to use them anyway. Bad Reality asked, why do I think video game consoles are taking longer to be considered retro? In 2002, the SNES was considered retro. In 2007, the N64 was considered retro. In 2020, the GameCube, not the Wii, is considered retro. That's an excellent question, and it could be the style of game, could be a lot of things. In fact, but that's a touchy subject, and that's completely opinion-based, and the first week Retro RGB went live, I actually didn't even know it was getting picked up in Google's algorithm. I thought it was I didn't think anybody knew about it. The very first thing anybody posted about me was they called me a delusional prick because I said the Sega Dreamcast has such good-looking games that some don't often feel retro. So that was my first introduction to the world, and when I first posted Retro RGB was people's oversensitivity of calling something retro or not. So I don't know how far I want to get into this, but I think it might be just the switch from 2D to 3D, and then maybe past the Wii would be considered maybe the motion controls and the whole opening up gaming to a different generation and different types of people. Maybe that still feels modern. For me personally, though, the line is very easily going to be drawn a few years from now in pre-HD and post-HD. Anything pre-HD is always going to be a total pain to get working right, as we know through all the trials and tribulations we go through getting the stuff working. Anything post-HD should be totally fine because it's all in the digital realm. And then at that point, it's just a matter of, can it render at a higher resolution? And I think software emulation is going to really be the key for that stuff. But yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it could just be the 2D to 3D look. But once again, it's all just opinions, and, I'll never forget that first forum post I ever read about Retro RGB was that. So I'm gonna definitely that always makes me smile because it was a good foreshadowing of what was gonna be the next 10 years of my life. But I think it's really just all preference based, and it could just be 2D to 3D that kind of sits in people's brains. Felipe says, "Hi Bob, this question will make me be laughed at by the community. I don't know. It takes a lot. There really are very few stupid questions, but let's proceed. I've been following your website, the RGB Guide videos, and many Q&As, and of course a big fan of gaming. However, I always felt like I'm missing the eye of telling which image is better, even when put side by side. Don't get me wrong, I do notice the difference between the RF modulator link and the RGB link, but I can only take so much from the subtle differences between video solutions or image quality. Do you recommend a more comprehensive guide or small tricks about image quality in general, mainly regarding Sharp 240p? I'm not talking about hardware, but only the final visual image. I know at the end our preferences arise from either experience or personal taste, or both, so feel free to explain. I'm assuming I've read all of the RGB guide. Feel free to explain, assuming that they've already read all of the RGB guide on the website. As a follow-up, I'm never sure if the images or videos are exactly how they look, mainly because of my own screen. I use a laptop and a 1080p TV. Good info. Only when I download the image and zoom in enough would I notice a thing or two. Do you think that overall our own screens may misguide us in judging the quality of an image? Should I be aware of a particular TV setting or something of the sort to make the TV to be as honest as it can be? So not even close to a stupid question, and I'm not laughing at all. You've absolutely nailed a lot of problems that I've had the whole time I've been running Retro RGB. So excellent questions, a couple of different answers. So how you're watching and viewing the content and the comparison definitely makes a big difference. So, I always laugh at people that comment like, oh, I watched your video on my phone and the side-by-side comparisons look identical. You're dumb. You're just trying to get me to buy something I don't need. Like, I don't even know how to respond to that anymore. And you came right out and said you're watching on a laptop or a 1080p TV. So that's good. That means if you're watching in full screen for the 1080p videos, you should be fine. But you really nailed how the best way to see these is only when you download the image and zoom would you notice a thing or two. Yeah. So that's definitely it. So addressing how to view the side-by-side content, it really is still images zoomed at 100% is perfect, or any videos watched at the original resolution they were shot and rendered in. But then you also have YouTube compression and all that ruins it. So seeing the differences is hard, but caring about the differences is the other part. And that's the thing that I try so hard to be clear about, and I fail miserably because I still get a lot of people saying that I only think anybody that uses anything other than RGB is stupid or anything like that. And it's never the case. For me, it's always answering the question of, hey, what is the sharpest solution if you care? But the real answer is don't use any solution that ruins the experience. So any of those cheap HDMI to console cables that take a progressive signal and treat it as interlaced and then add 3 to 5 frames of lag, that ruins the experience. Bad emulation ruins the experience. Composite video directly into a flat panel in most cases would. However, composite video into a RetroTink is fine. Try to step up to S-Video. But for me, it's way more important to try to teach people what's the wrong thing to do, and then where you're going to get the bigger steps in image quality. So if you're playing on a 4K flat panel, a good one, maybe not a calibrated OLED, but a good TV that looks good that you're happy with. Using a RetroTink, which outputs 480p, is a perfectly good solution. It's not the sharpest, but whatever. However, if you have a choice between using composite video, S-Video, or component video into that RetroTink, I do think it's worth it to step up to the higher 2 signals, but going from composite to S-Video will be a bigger jump than S-Video to composite. So that's the stuff that you should pay attention to, and that's the stuff that's important. And the only other exceptions to that is if sharpness is something that's important to you. So to use an analogy, I know a lot of people where if they have audio hum on anything, games, music, TV, it drives them crazy. It takes away from the experience. So if you're the type of person where blurring on the screen or ghosting in images or something really takes away from the experience for you, then that's when you would probably want to get into obsessing about video quality. I've always done it more from a research point of view, but in all honesty, it's comes down to what your eyes want to see. So if you spent over $1,000 on a BVM and had it recapped and calibrated, and you wanted to get the best picture out of like your Super Nintendo, I would say take the time to go from the 2-chip, 3-chip, whatever you want to call it, to one of the 1 chips. I think you would notice a difference. But I don't know if your average person would notice a difference between a nice, good condition 1 chip and one that's been RGB bypassed. If you're capturing video, if you're upscaling to 4K, if you're using a flat panel, you might start to be able to notice the differences. But I don't think you're missing the eye of telling which image is better. I think once you get past a certain point, it might just not matter to you at all, which is totally fine. That's just like the audio thing. There's certain things about certain audio that I listen to that, like clipping, just makes it unlistenable to me, whereas like a little bit of hum or buzz never bothered me. So it really just comes down to what your eyes want to see, but you absolutely nailed everything. Look at everything at the original resolution when you're doing the side-by-sides, and just pick whatever matters in your setup. The only other thing for video that does bother me is bad jail bars. So like a Sega Genesis that's never been modded before using RGB, like that would kind of bug me, regardless if you're using composite video or RGB, if you're doing it on a flat screen or flat panel or a CRT, whatever. So just choose whatever, when you're looking at these things, if your eye picks out something that drives you crazy, stay away from it. And if you see 2 comparisons that aren't too far apart, it doesn't really matter to you, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just stay away from those garbage console to HDMI cables that add all the lag. Jason Guffey's been having weird static running up their screen when using the OSSC with the PS1 on a 4K screen. Every game does it, and they're using the Insurrection Industries SCART cable for the PS1 and playing 240p games. To compare, their SNES in 240p through the OSSC has no issues whatsoever. A user on the Video Game Perfection forum told me to look into a power line issue, but I haven't had any luck. Now, you posted a few videos of this. This is something... this is certainly something that I think I've run into before in different cases. Mine happened with the Nintendo Wii, and it was the same thing. It was just one horizontal line that would slowly go up the screen, and then it would disappear and come up again. And it eventually went away, and I never knew why. And in talking to Renee, and I think it was the same Retro Roundtable episode I talked about before, it could be that I had the Wii plugged into a different power source than the TV. So try plugging, try making sure your PS1, your OSSC, and your TV are all plugged into the same place. Now, assuming it's plugged into the same power strip as your Super Nintendo, it could possibly be that the power board inside your PS1 is going bad. I would suggest having that recapped or buying an OEM replacement that's been refurbished. I don't want to go off on the rant again, but I'm not a fan of aftermarket PSUs. If you're using the PS1, the PSONE with the external power supply, you might want to try a different one of those just for the heck of it. But, this is something that really, it could be the SCART cable. Maybe you got one that had a manufacturing issue. It doesn't happen often, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. But when I hear about stuff like this, my gut tells me power. So try another PS1 if you have the ability to, and basically just try to swap things out one at a time until you get to the issue. And I know it's rough because it's not like you could just, walk down to a friend's house and get, full access to a full retro setup, especially these days. But, I'm not really sure where to go unless you start swapping things out just to test. So my gut's telling me power. I could be wrong. And I believe you said you're going directly into the OSSC, not through a switch. So that would be fine. That should be fine as well. Also, you said you ordered, Taku Switch some months ago, but it's been delayed pretty hard by COVID. Have my opinions changed on it at all since my video review? No. It's a good basic SCART switch. It shouldn't add any interference at all. It should just be a decent way to get basic switching between consoles. Then, if you don't need sync regeneration, if you don't need automatic switching, then it should be a perfectly good solution for you. So definitely, I haven't learned anything new about it. I have heard that there's been shipping issues all across the world, especially in that area. So sorry that, you're not being able to get yours. But yeah, back to your initial question, my gut says it might be power. So start swapping things out, try different cables, different PS1, and see if that fixes it. Well, that's it for this week. As always, thanks so much to everybody that participates in these. I really enjoy doing them. And if you're new to these, ask any question you would like, wherever the latest Q&A post is, wherever it is that you support. I have to leave comments on for YouTube just for algorithm reasons, but to be honest, this is, in no disrespect to anybody, but this is a thank you and a way to interact with people that support. I answer a million questions on every other video, but the Q&As are really just meant for you. So thank you all very much. Any questions you have, feel free to ask, and I'll see you next week.